I've lived in Mill Hollow my whole life. It's a small town, quiet and unremarkable, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and the most exciting thing that happens is the annual fall festival. That is, until the radio station started airing the program. It was late summer when it began, a Friday night. I was sitting on my porch, the static hum of the old radio playing softly beside me, when the signal changed. At first, I didn't think much of it, just some technical issue, I figured. Mill Hollow's local station, 89.3 FM, was always prone to hiccups. But then the voice came through the static, crackling, ghostly. "Good evening," the voice said, slow and deliberate. "Welcome to the midnight hour." I furrowed my brow. I'd never heard of the show before. The voice had an old-fashioned quality to it, like something from a broadcast in the 1950s. There was an eerie melody playing in the background, a simple piano tune that repeated over and over, almost hypnotic. I listened, curious. The voice continued, telling a story, an unsettling tale about a man who lived alone on the edge of town. He started receiving phone calls late at night, always from a different number. The person on the other end never spoke, just breathed into the receiver. Each night the calls came closer together, until one evening the man answered to hear his own voice on the line, repeating his name over and over. The next morning he was found dead, his phone off the hook. It was the kind of story that sent a shiver down my spine. When it ended, the voice signed off with a simple, "Until next time." The music faded, and the station returned to its usual programming. Just a one-off show, I figured. Some late-night nostalgia piece, but the next morning, Mill Hollow woke up to news that sent shockwaves through the town. Old Mr. Phelps, who lived alone on the edge of town, had died in the night. His phone had been off the hook when the sheriff found him. It was too strange to be a coincidence. At first, no one connected the dots. People wrote it off as just another tragedy. Mr. Phelps was old, after all, heart attack probably, but then it happened again. The next night the midnight hour came on at exactly 11:59 p.m. This time, the voice told the story of a woman who heard a knocking sound in her attic, late at night. She ignored it at first, assuming it was the wind or perhaps a raccoon, but the knocking grew louder, more insistent, until one night. She couldn't bear it any longer. She climbed the creaky stairs to the attic, flashlight in hand. The knocking stopped as soon as she opened the door. But as she turned to leave, the flashlight flickered, and she saw them, eyes staring at her from the darkness. The next morning, they found her body at the foot of the attic stairs. The story was creepy, yes, but the chill didn't set in until the next morning, when Mill Hollow's phone lines lit up with news that Sarah Dawson, who lived in a house at the edge of the woods, had fallen to her death. The sheriff found her at the bottom of her attic stairs, her flashlight still clutched in her hand. That's when people started to panic. The station never advertised the show. There were no schedules, no promotions, nothing. It just appeared out of nowhere, taking over the frequency. And after that second story came true, people started paying attention. By the third night, no one wanted to listen. But it didn't matter. The show aired, no matter what. Even if you turned off your radio, the midnight hour would find its way to you. Phones, computers, even car radios, all would pick up the broadcast, and once the voice started, you had no choice but to listen. The third story was about a car crash. A couple, driving late at night on an empty road, heard a strange noise coming from the back seat. The driver glanced in the rearview mirror and saw a figure sitting behind them, grinning wide and impossibly dark. They never had a chance to react. The car veered off the road and slammed into a tree. The voice ended with its usual, "Until next time." Sure enough, the next morning, there was a crash. A couple driving along Route 13 hit a tree after swerving off the road. Both of them died on impact. People were terrified by this point. We tried everything. Some folks drove out of town, hoping to escape the broadcast's reach. Others smashed their radios, broke their phones, anything to stop hearing that cursed program. But it didn't work. Wherever you went, wherever you hid, the midnight hour would find you. The fourth night, everyone waited with bated breath. We all knew something horrible was coming, but we didn't know what. At 11:59 p.m., the radio came to life once again. "Good evening," the voice said, just as it always did. But this time, There was something different. The music in the background was darker, slower. The voice, too, seemed deeper, more menacing. "Tonight's tale," it whispered, "is the final chapter." A collective dread washed over the town. Final chapter. We all knew what it meant. The voice began its story, and this time it wasn't about a specific person. It was about Mill Hollow, the town itself. It described how a fog would roll in from the woods, thick and choking. The people of the town would try to run, but no matter where they went, the fog would follow. It would seep into their homes, their lungs, until all that was left was silence. An entire town wiped from existence, swallowed by the mist. I sat frozen in my living room, listening as the story unfolded, feeling the weight of every word. My phone buzzed with messages from friends, all asking the same thing. What do we do? But no one had an answer. We couldn't stop it. The voice droned on, slow and deliberate, describing in vivid detail how the fog would consume us, how we'd feel the cold grip of something ancient pulling us into the darkness. And then, just as the story reached its peak, the voice paused. "Good night, Mill Hollow," it said, its tone almost mocking. "It's been a pleasure." The broadcast cut out, replaced by static. I glanced out the window. The streets were empty. The town felt eerily still, as if holding its breath. Then in the distance I saw it, rolling in from the woods, just like the voice had said. The fog, it moved unnaturally, thick and swirling, darker than any fog I had ever seen. It crawled over the trees, over the hills, inching its way toward town. My heart pounded in my chest. I grabbed my phone, but it was dead. No signal. The fog was already cutting us off. Panic spread like wildfire. People fled their homes, trying to escape, but there was nowhere to go. The fog was everywhere, closing in from all sides. I could hear screams in the distance, muffled by the thick air. I tried to leave too, grabbing my car keys and running out the door. But the moment I stepped outside, the cold hit me. It was like stepping into another world. The fog wasn't just cold, it was alive. It twisted around me, pulling at my clothes, whispering in my ears. I could barely see a few feet in front of me. I stumbled forward, trying to reach my car, but the fog was too thick. It pressed against me, suffocating, filling my lungs with its icy breath. I collapsed to my knees, gasping for air, feeling the weight of it dragging me down. And then, as the world around me dimmed, I heard it. The voice, not from the radio this time, but from within the fog itself. "Until next time." That's when I realized there would be no next time. The voice had always been with us, always watching, always waiting. The stories weren't just predictions. They were promises. And now, as the fog closed in around me, I knew that Mill Hollow was the final chapter. We were the story, and we were ending. When I first moved into my new apartment, I was excited. It was perfect. A cozy little one-bedroom on the 4th floor of an old building in a quiet neighborhood. The rent was cheaper than I expected, and the landlord seemed unusually eager to have me move in. I brushed it off. People had their reasons. It started the second night. I was sitting on the couch, unpacking some boxes when I glanced at the window. There, in the dim light from the street lamp below, stood a figure. Motionless, it was wearing a white mask, the kind you'd expect to see in an old horror movie, blank, expressionless. The figure was just standing there, staring directly up at me. A chill ran down my spine, but I quickly rationalized it. Some weirdo, maybe? A prank. I laughed it off nervously, and the curtains closed, trying to shake the unease that gnawed at the edges of my mind. But the figure came back the next night, and the night after that. It didn't move. It didn't make a sound. It just stood there at exactly midnight, looking up at my window. Even with the curtains closed, I could feel its eyes, or whatever was behind that mask, burning into me. I started to dread the nights, the moments leading up to midnight. I'd sit on the couch, my eyes glued to the clock, heart pounding, waiting for it to appear. And it always did. After a week I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to confront it. On the 7th night, at exactly midnight, I threw on a coat, grabbed my phone, and stormed down to the street. But when I got outside, the figure was gone. The street was empty. It was as if it had evaporated into thin air. I paced the sidewalk, looking up at my window, then down the street. No one was there. No sign of the masked figure. I went back inside, feeling foolish and more than a little spooked. But the moment I closed the apartment door behind me, I felt it. That cold, crawling sensation on the back of my neck. I ran to the window, throwing the curtains open. It was back, standing in the exact same spot, staring up at me. The next morning, I went straight to the landlord. I half expected him to laugh at me, but when I described the figure, his face turned pale. "You saw it?" he asked quietly, eyes darting to the window as if the thing might be there in broad daylight. I don't know what it is," I stammered, "but it's there, every night." He sighed, rubbing his temples. "You're not the first, you know." "What?" My voice trembled. "Everyone who's lived in that apartment has seen it. They all complained about the same thing, this figure. Every night, midnight, always staring. No one ever figured out who or what it is. Some people thought it was a stalker, some kind of deranged person. Others, well, they thought it was something else. And what happened to them? The people who lived here before me." He hesitated, then muttered. "They moved out, or they tried to." That was a strange answer. "What do you mean, tried to?" He swallowed hard, looking down at his hands. "Most of them disappeared. No one knows where they went." I left the office feeling more unnerved than ever. The thought of moving out crossed my mind immediately, but something inside me, curiosity, stubbornness, I'm not sure, kept me rooted in place. I had to know what was happening. I had to understand. That night I didn't sleep. Midnight came, and I watched as the figure appeared once again in its usual spot. But this time I didn't turn away. I didn't close the curtains. I stared back. Suddenly, I noticed something I hadn't before. The figure wasn't entirely still. It was subtle, but the longer I looked, the more I realized that its head was tilting ever so slightly, as if trying to see me more clearly. I grabbed my phone, snapping pictures, trying to capture the evidence, but each photo came out wrong. The figure was there, but its outline was blurred, as if it wasn't really solid. Then the nightmare escalated. I woke up in the middle of the night to a sound, something scraping against glass. My heart raced as I turned my head slowly toward the window. The figure was still outside, but now it was closer, much closer. Standing right outside my window, its pale mask pressed against the glass, the outline of its breath fogging the pane. I couldn't breathe. My body froze. It was impossible. I was on the 4th floor. The scraping continued. A long, deliberate drag of what sounded like nails along the glass. The mask remained expressionless, but I could feel something behind it, a presence. Something ancient, malevolent. Suddenly the window rattled. The figure's hand moved, slowly, purposefully, toward the latch. My heart stopped. It was trying to get in. With a surge of adrenaline, I threw myself out of bed, grabbed the nearest object I could find, a lamp, and hurled it at the window. The glass cracked, and the figure vanished. I stood there, panting, staring at the fractured glass, trying to make sense of what had just happened. That's when I noticed something new. A small symbol etched into the window frame. It hadn't been there before. A circle with strange, jagged lines branching out from it, like some kind of twisted sun. The next day I did some digging. I searched through old newspapers, local legends, anything I could find about the building. It didn't take long before I found what I was looking for. Years ago, a man had lived in my apartment. A recluse, by all accounts he was an artist, obsessed with masks. He'd make them day and night, filling his apartment with hundreds of them. Then one day he snapped. No one knows exactly what happened. But when the police finally broke into his apartment, they found him standing in front of the window, wearing one of his masks, staring out at the street below. He had carved that same symbol into the walls, the floor, the windows, and he wasn't alone. His wife's body was found in the closet, mutilated beyond recognition. He had killed her. And then, just as the police tried to arrest him, he jumped out the window, plunging to his death. From that moment on, every tenant who lived in the apartment reported seeing the figure. Some said it was the artist. Others believed it was something else, something darker. I packed my bags the next day, determined to leave, but as I stood at the door, suitcase in hand, something stopped me, a whisper, faint, almost imperceptible, coming from the cracked window. "Stay," I turned, heart pounding. The figure was there again, at the window, closer than ever. Its hand was raised, fingers tapping gently against the glass, as if beckoning me, and though every instinct screamed at me to run, I couldn't move. I couldn't leave. Because now it wasn't just outside the window, it was inside my mind. I've always had a fascination with old buildings, the way their walls hold onto stories long after the people who lived within them are gone. As an architect, I've spent years studying them, restoring them, giving life back to forgotten structures. But the mansion on the outskirts of town, Holloway House, was different. For as long as I could remember, people whispered about it. They said it was cursed, haunted by the souls of those who once lived there. Abandoned for nearly a century, it sat at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by a thick forest, windows boarded up, ivy crawling over the cracked stone walls. It loomed like a ghost of a past no one wanted to remember. Of course, that made it irresistible to me. The day I decided to explore it was a gray, overcast afternoon. Clouds hung low, and the air was damp with the smell of rain that had yet to fall. I brought a flashlight, my sketchbook, and a camera, tools of my trade. I told myself it was just a harmless investigation. After all, I'd explored plenty of old houses before. What made this one any different? The moment I stepped through the front door, I felt it. A heaviness in the air, like the house was watching me. The floors creaked beneath my feet, the walls seemed to whisper, but I shook it off. Old houses always had a way of playing tricks on the senses. The interior was a maze of decaying grandeur, peeling wallpaper, cobwebs draping across long-forgotten furniture, chandeliers hanging precariously from the ceiling. I wandered from room to room, documenting the structure, admiring the craftsmanship hidden beneath the layers of dust and neglect. Then, in the back of the house, I found it. The staircase. It was unlike anything I had ever seen. Tucked behind an ornate wooden door that had been left ajar, it spiraled downward, a perfect helix of intricately carved wood. The banister was smooth, polished, untouched by time. It descended into darkness, and though the house had clearly fallen into ruin, the staircase felt alive, as if it had been waiting for me. Curiosity tugged at me, and I couldn't resist. I shone my flashlight down into the abyss, but the light didn't reach the bottom. There was no bottom, just endless stairs winding down into the earth. Against my better judgment, I stepped onto the first stair, then the second. And then something strange happened. The air shifted. At first I didn't notice it, but as I descended, the temperature dropped. It wasn't the coolness of a basement. It was the deep, biting cold of a winter night. And the further I went, the more the house above seemed to slip away. The sounds of the creaking floors and the distant groan of the wind were replaced by an oppressive silence. My footsteps echoed, hollow and unnatural. After what felt like hours, I stopped to catch my breath. That's when I saw the first sign that this staircase was more than just a forgotten architectural marvel. An old toy, a small wooden horse, sat on one of the steps, its paint chipped and faded. I crouched down to examine it, running my fingers over its surface. It looked ancient, something from a different era. I hadn't seen anything like it in the house above. I continued downward. The next object I found was a letter, yellowed with age, tucked between two steps. I picked it up carefully, unfolding the fragile paper. The ink had smeared, but I could make out a few words. Help me, trapped forever. A cold sweat broke out on my skin. I stuffed the letter into my pocket and kept walking, my heart pounding in my chest. More remnants appeared as I descended, an old photograph of a family, their faces blurred, an antique key, a child's shoe. They were scattered like breadcrumbs, but none of it made sense. The house above had been abandoned for years, but these things, they felt like they had been left here deliberately. As I descended deeper, time began to stretch in strange ways. Minutes felt like hours, and hours felt like days. My watch had stopped working, and the beam of my flashlight seemed to dim with every step, as if the darkness was swallowing it whole. I thought about turning back, but some terrible curiosity, pushed me forward. I had to know where the staircase led. I had to see what was at the bottom. That's when I noticed the voices. At first, they were faint, like a distant murmur, but as I went deeper, they grew louder, more distinct. I couldn't make out the words, but there was an urgency to them, a desperation that chilled me to the bone. They echoed around me, bouncing off the walls of the narrow staircase, growing louder and louder until they filled my head, pounding like a drum. I stopped, clutching the banister, trying to steady myself. I was close now, I could feel it. Then I saw it, the doorway. It appeared out of the darkness, an archway carved into the stone, leading to a small room. I stepped off the staircase and into the room, my breath catching in my throat. The walls were lined with shelves, and on each shelf sat dozens, no hundreds, of masks. They were grotesque, twisted faces, some smiling, some screaming, others frozen in expressions of terror. Each one seemed to be watching me, their hollow eyes following my every move. In the center of the room stood a figure. It was draped in black, its face hidden beneath a hood. I couldn't tell if it was human or something else. My flashlight flickered, the beam struggling to cut through the thick darkness that seemed to pulse around the figure. What is this place?" I whispered, my voice shaking. The figure didn't move, but I felt its presence pressing down on me, suffocating me. "You should not have come," a voice rasped, though the figure's lips did not move. The words echoed in my mind, not through my ears. I stumbled back, heart racing. I wanted to run, but my legs felt heavy, rooted to the ground. I glanced at the staircase the way out, but something held me in place. "What is this? What do you want?" I demanded, my voice trembling. The figure raised its head slightly, and beneath the hood, I saw something that made my blood turn to ice. It was wearing a mask, but it wasn't just any mask, it was my face, twisted, contorted, my own eyes staring back at me in agony. I gasped, stumbling back, nearly tripping over the threshold of the room. The figure began to move toward me, slow and deliberate. I bolted, sprinting back to the staircase, taking the steps 2 at a time, my heart pounding so loud it drowned out the voices that still whispered all around me. I didn't dare look back. I didn't stop until I burst through the door at the top, back into the decaying mansion. Gasping for air, I slammed the door shut behind me, my hands trembling. The house was silent, but the weight of what I had just seen hung heavy in the air. I glanced around, trying to ground myself, but something was wrong. The furniture, the wallpaper. It was all different. Older, the house had changed. I ran to the front door, wrenching it open. Outside, the forest had thickened, the path gone, swallowed by the trees. The sky was a dark, swirling mass, time itself seeming to bend and warp. I had escaped the staircase, but I hadn't escaped the house, and somewhere deep below, I knew the figure was still waiting, and it was wearing my face,